Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next topic in modern American history. And this time we're going to be looking at the Cold War. And I do want to point out that the way that I've approached the Cold War material in this case is sort of thematically, right? We're going to look at it as a particular topic rather than insert different parts of the Cold War into different individual decades or sort of a timeline of American history. And so this is going to be a topic that when we deal with it will cover about 45 years worth of material. And so I don't want people to get confused as we get into other material in the next few sections, because these things will all sort of overlap. While I won't talk about the Cold War per se when I get into the 60s and 70s or the 80s and 90s or things like that, keep in mind that what we are talking about here was certainly all taking place at the same time as things that I will be talking about in sort of separate sections going forward. So just wanted to kind of point that out. I realize that it can be a little confusing depending on how you sort of process chronologies and connections between topics and things like that. But if you've got any questions about any of that, please be sure to let me know so that I can do my best to help point you in the right direction there. So the Cold War is essentially the term that's given to the tension that exists between the United States and the Soviet Union primarily, that begins almost immediately with the end of World War II. So during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are sort of uncomfortable allies. Certainly, both of those countries are waging war, especially against Nazi Germany, but also, in a sense, against Japan. That's a complicated thing that we won't get into, but the alliance during the war is already kind of prickly, let's say. With the end of the war, it's clear pretty immediately that the Soviet Union is working very hard to position itself to be the dominant, most influential power, especially in Eastern Europe. And the United States and Britain, then, by contrast, are the dominant influences in Western Europe. And this is going to be a sort of a binary relationship that will last for quite some time, really up into the 1980s. And it is, in many ways, the foundation for a sort of a diplomatic message that is going to become one of the most important conceptual documents really in all of American history. So in the mid-1940s, the United States is watching kind of skeptically what the Soviet Union is doing diplomatically. And a diplomat, sort of fairly minor, to be honest, fairly minor diplomat in Europe at the time, a guy named George Kennan, sends back to the United States a message, a long message, that comes to be known as the Long Telegram. And in the Long Telegram, Kennan introduces this concept of containment. And containment will become really the driving sort of perception that the United States has about the Soviet Union. Kennan says that the Soviet Union wants to expand its power, either in terms of controlling certain territory itself, or at the very least, through the expansion of its influence, right, to kind of bring different countries under their influence, if not outright control. And Kennan says this is a problem. This is a problem not just for American interests, but it's also a problem potentially for the stability of the entire world. And so Kennan suggests that the way the United States should deal with this is not to confront the Soviet Union directly, right? He doesn't say, well, the United States should go to war with the Soviet Union. and eliminate it as a potential threat or a potential competitor. Kennan says instead the United States should contain the Soviet Union to prevent it from expanding, either in terms of adding new territory or in terms of preventing the Soviet Union's ability to influence or coerce otherwise independent nations. And containment is going to be an essential component of the entire Cold War because it really is the fundamental defining sort of ideology in the way the United States approaches Cold War diplomacy, the way it approaches events that take place during the Cold War, and so on. And so as we go through this particular topic, you're going to see a number of different times when I'll refer back to containment, whether it is precisely this specific concept or a sort of a tweak or an enhancement of the original idea of containment. All of what happens between basically 1945 and 1989 or so is focused on that particular idea in one way or another. So really, really important to understand that and sort of recognize how it fits in. So one example of containment, excuse me, comes in the form of what's known as the Truman Doctrine. And in the 1940s, Harry Truman, who becomes president after Roosevelt's death in April of 1945, Harry Truman issues this statement where he says, "We will use any economic means necessary to support the governments of independent, quote-unquote democratic countries in their attempts to hold off the influence or the insurgence of communism." And this is originally meant to deal with Greece and Turkey, which in the 1940s are fighting internal wars over the question of who will govern that country. And the United States looks at this and they say, well, it looks like the Soviet Union is trying to sort of stick their noses into these situations to push those countries over the edge towards becoming communist. Truman says, we're not going to go to war over this. We're not going to use military force to try to sort of change this situation, but we will use economic pressure, either in terms of supporting those countries in their attempts to resist, or in terms of leveraging economic kinds of influence to limit the ability for the communists and the Soviets to make those inroads. And a good example of the Truman Doctrine, excuse me, is what's known as the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is a huge aid package for countries in especially Western Europe to recover after World War II. So the Second World War is devastating to the economies and the populations of countries throughout Europe. And so Truman says, well, it's problematic that these countries are in such dire straits financially because this could cause them to be more open to the idea of communism as an ideology. And Truman says what we need to do is we need to prop up their economies in some way so that that temptation of becoming communist is no longer there. And so under the Marshall Plan, it's named for the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named George Marshall. Under the Marshall Plan, the United States provides billions and billions of dollars to European countries that those countries can then use to buy products from the United States that can help those countries kind of recover. And so it's a great deal for the European countries like Britain or France or the Netherlands because it gives them that financial support that they can use to try to rebuild their infrastructure, while at the same time it's helping the American economy because all of that money that is loaned to those European powers has to be spent on American products. And so it's going to help spur a fairly significant expansion of the American economy after World War II as well. The Soviets, as you can probably imagine, aren't thrilled with this. And so they begin to tighten their control in Eastern Europe, and they also start to tighten their control over parts of Germany. Now, this is where it's going to get potentially a little bit tricky, so try to bear with me and be sure to ask questions if you have them. At the very end of World War II, Germany was carved into 4 pieces. And those pieces were going to be controlled by the 4 major powers in Europe at the time. The Soviet Union, Britain, France, and then the United States, right? Obviously, the United States is not a European country, but the United States being now one of the superpowers on the planet, the U.S. positions itself to be an overseer, let's say, of European affairs. So the western part of Germany was divided between the US, Britain, and France, while the eastern part of Germany was under Soviet control. And in theory, this would be a temporary situation until Germany was back on its feet, at which point all of those parts would be unified and back into a single German nation, and it would run its own affairs as it had before. Well, that never takes place. The Soviet Union maintains its own separate control and influence over Eastern Germany. And, to make matters worse, Berlin, the capital of Germany, soon to be the capital of East Germany, Berlin is entirely inside the eastern part of Germany that is under Soviet control. The city of Berlin had also been divided into 4 parts. This is where, by the early 1960s, the Berlin Wall comes into play. If you've heard of the Berlin Wall, that is a wall that separates the eastern Soviet-controlled or Soviet satellite part of Berlin, the city, from the western part of Berlin, the city. But all of Berlin is inside East Germany. The Soviets decide that they will blockade the city, basically as punishment for things like the Marshall Plan. So they put up barriers, essentially, and prevent the arrival of airplanes and trains and that kind of thing into the city, in the hopes that they can sort of force the United States and Britain and France to change policy regarding Germany. Truman looks at this and he says, well, I can't go to war over this, or he chooses not to go to war over this, maybe more accurately. But instead, he decides to institute an airlift, right? Basically using airplanes to fly supplies and goods and materials and drop them into Germany by parachute, drop them directly into Berlin by parachute, and in some cases to fly them into the airport that is on the western side of Berlin, and use that as a way to kind of undermine this blockade. It works, and eventually the Soviets back down. Over time, though, the Soviets get more and more aggressive in the way that they deal with Berlin, and this is going to lead by the early 1960s to the construction of the Berlin Wall. But at the time, in 1947, 1948, the Berlin airlift is successful. But there are other examples of the way that tensions begin to increase between, quote-unquote, the West, primarily the United States, and, quote-unquote, the East, which is mainly the Soviet Union. One of those is the creation in 1949 of a mutual defense alliance between major powers in Europe and North America called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So NATO is not an aggressive or offensive kind of agency. Certainly it can be interpreted that way by the Soviets, but its stated purpose is to allow major powers in Europe to kind of coordinate their efforts in the face of the possibility of a Soviet attack. So if this would happen, all of the members of NATO would work together to defend each other. And the Soviets decide that they will respond to the creation of NATO with their own alliance, which is known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact then includes the Soviet Union and then countries that are kind of satellite countries of the Soviet Union, places like Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or things like that. NATO is the United States and Canada and Britain and France and the Netherlands and West Germany and countries like that. So what we notice then during this process is sort of this ongoing kind of escalation of tensions between the American-led side and the Soviet-led side. And one of the ways where we see this most visibly is in the arms race, the nuclear arms race. And until 1949, the United States was the only country in the world to have nuclear weapons. So between 1945, when they are basically introduced to the world, and 1949, when the Soviets drop their first or explode their first atomic bomb, the United States is the only country on the planet that has nuclear weapons. And as you can probably guess, this concerns the Soviets because this is kind of provocative, right? The United States is more and more sort of resistant to Soviet desires in the world. And to kind of add insult to that, the United States is the only country that has the atomic bomb. And so the Soviets are threatened. And they work very, very hard to develop their own nuclear technology, based in no small part on information that they get from spies who are working in the United States, so that in 1949, they detonate their first atomic bomb. And this immediately ramps up tensions in the Cold War to a new level, because now the United States isn't comfortable in the fact that they're the only country in the world that has the atom bomb. Now the Soviets, increasingly their kind of sworn enemy, also have nuclear weapons. And so we see this ramping up of the nuclear arms race, whether it's in terms of the number of nuclear weapons in each arsenal, or whether it's in terms of the potential devastation, the power of the weapons in each arsenal. And so the United States develops a hydrogen bomb, which is many times more powerful than the atomic bombs. You can see on the map at the top right, this is a map, an aerial photograph of New York City. The tiny circle in the sort of top center, that represents the amount of destructive capacity from the atom bomb, like those that were dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The big circle represents the destructive capacity of the hydrogen bomb, many, many more times destructive. In addition, other countries begin acquiring their own nuclear weapons. So Great Britain and France, over time, countries like China or India, so that by the 1990s, there are a number of nations around the world that have nuclear weapons and the capacity to use nuclear weapons, which just continues to kind of escalate tensions, even though now the Cold War is technically over. The threat of nuclear weapons is certainly still a significant one and is still something that worries people inside and outside of governments around the world. So you have then this sort of escalation during the 1940s where Americans are worried more and more, not just about the Soviet Union itself, but because of other things that take place, a concern that communism as an ideology is becoming more and more threatening to the entire planet. And one of those developments certainly is the detonation of the Soviet atomic bomb in 1949. But 1949 is also a bad year for Americans who are worried about communism, because that's the year when China becomes communist as well. And so this is going to be a significant fear, because now it's apparent that communism as an ideology is on the rise, not just because of Soviet actions, but now one of the most populous countries on the planet is also communist. And so even though this wasn't entirely a surprise, people that were watching what was going on in China could see the writing on the wall as Mao Zedong gets more and more and more powerful, and the Chinese Civil War becomes sort of falls more in his favor. But it is still a bit of a shock, especially when you tie it in that same year, as I said, to the detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb. And so the rhetoric of the Cold War begins to get stronger and stronger. And in 1949, the National Security Council releases a document, or creates a document known as NSC 68. Basically, what it says is an enhancement of containment. And where Kennan said, you know, look, the Soviets desire expansion, they desire control, they desire territorial growth and global influence, NSC 68 paints this more in almost religious terms by saying you have this godless, evil side, which is communist totalitarianism, versus the good guys, which represent capitalist democracies led by the United States. And NSC 68 says the Soviets are bent on global domination. And this is sort of a quasi-religion for them, that they have a fanatical devotion to expanding the size of the Soviet Union, and at the very least, growing communism around the world. And NSC 68 still maintains containment from the standpoint of saying, we shouldn't go to actual war with the Soviet Union directly. But NSC 68 does point more in the direction of possibly using military force in situations that call for it as part of this broader process of containment. And the first place that this is then put to the test is Korea. And this is going to be the first confrontation between basically the Western Bloc, again, Western Bloc meaning essentially the United States and Britain and those capitalist democracies that I just talked about, versus the Eastern Bloc, which is increasingly meant to represent the Soviet Union, now China, and communism, global communism on the whole. This is, in some ways, a precursor to things that will happen in Vietnam. But it is a very different war. It is its own kind of thing. And it begins because Korea, much like Germany, at the end of World War II, was divided. Only this time it was divided in half, basically halfway north and south. And in 1950, in the summer of 1950, forces from North Korea invade South Korea. And the South Korean army is really no match for this. So they collapse pretty dramatically. In light of all of this, Truman doesn't send American soldiers to Korea. He sends American soldiers to protect Japan. The fear is that the North Koreans, backed as they were by the Soviet Union, would eventually gobble up all of the Korean peninsula and then would leap across the Sea of Japan and attack Japan and take it over as well, right? That this would be part of a larger sort of threat to Japan and other parts of Asia. So Truman commits American troops to Japan. This leads to the incident becoming more the concern of the United Nations, where the United Nations basically encourages or requests that member nations contribute military force to restore the boundaries of North and South Korea. And so this becomes officially a United Nations action. It is not technically a war that the United States declares against a particular enemy. The United States is the primary contributor to the United Nations force, the combined United Nations force that is responsible for ensuring South Korea's independence. And so the Korean War really is, in actual fact, kind of a short conflict, because the majority of the time that is sort of designated as the Korean War technically is negotiations to try to end the war. But the conflict is, in many ways, a seesaw between American successes or United Nations successes and North Korean successes. And one of the reasons why the North Koreans are so successful is the support that they receive from the Soviet Union, and by the fall of 1950, the support that the North Koreans receive from the Chinese. And so by the end of 1950, basically it has reached something of a stalemate. There have been moments where each side has been on the verge of absolute defeat, but political considerations being what they are at the time, there is a reluctance to maintain a wider and wider conflict, or to sort of risk a wider and wider conflict. And so negotiations begin, basically lasting for 2 years, leading to an armistice, a ceasefire, but not technically leading to an official peace treaty. So in actual fact, the Korean War is still technically going on, because there has never been an official treaty settling the dispute itself. This is, in some ways, a precursor to Vietnam. We'll talk about that when we get into Vietnam in a different section. But there are some parallels, especially in terms of the fact that it's kind of a proxy war, in the sense that it allows the United States and the Soviet Union to fight at each other without necessarily fighting each other directly. This is also going to have political ramifications, right? The experiences of Korea and the apparent weakness of Truman and his Democratic administration leads to a fairly significant Republican victory in the 1952 presidential election, and also in Congress and local elections as well, right? Republicans are increasingly positioning themselves as the party that is tough on communism. And what happens in Korea, to some extent, helps the Republican sort of political narrative so that they can achieve some successes in the 1952 election. And this is going to then help to establish communism and sort of the Cold War more generally as a major factor in a lot of presidential elections all the way through the 1980s from this point forward. It then also contributes to the widespread belief that, well, you know, apparently the Soviets, apparently communism is this dangerous, expansive threat to world stability. And because Americans increasingly see a lot of what's happening in the world through the lens of communism versus America, it just feeds into that kind of potentially myopic and dangerous kind of perspective in some ways. But Korea is definitely a significant moment in the sort of changing understanding of what the Cold War represents and what kinds of threats it actually presents to the world. And so that's where we'll pause here. Our next section will take the Cold War up into the 1960s and also talk about some of the things that are happening on the home front with government kinds of investigations and hearings into different industries, and in some cases, really, really, really inappropriate sorts of accusations and threats against American citizens simply because of political affiliations or enthusiasms that they might have had. So we'll talk about that. And then the third section, the third recording of this particular topic, will take us through the 70s and 80s and up to the end of the Cold War itself. And so those recordings will probably be a little bit shorter than this one. There's a little bit less that we have to go through. And so I look forward to all of that. Let me know if you've got questions about anything. Make sure you're checking out the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. And I will see everybody shortly.